Is the government under Keir Starmer now slipping into freefall as defense chiefs have reportedly quit in protest, marking a dramatic escalation inside the country's military leadership? Two top ministers have walked out, citing what they describe as a serious funding failure within the armed forces. At Downing Street, the government is being rocked as a fierce military budget dispute spills into open crisis. Is the British Prime Minister losing control over the Labour Party just 2 years into office, as internal fractures begin to widen? And with a senior defense figure stepping aside amid growing Russian pressure across Europe, is the leadership losing control at the worst possible moment? The UK Prime Minister has suffered a major political blow after Defence Secretary John Healey resigned over growing dispute on military spending. UK Defence Secretary John Healey resigned after dispute with Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government over military spending priorities, exposing divisions over Britain's defence strategy at a time of growing international instability. In his resignation letter published on X on June 10, John Healey pointed directly to disagreements over defence funding, arguing that the resources allocated to the military were insufficient for the challenges Britain could face. The controversy unfolded as the United Kingdom came under increasing pressure to raise military spending, particularly as the United States appeared increasingly focused on crises outside Europe and encouraged allies to shoulder more of the defence burden. Britain's long-awaited defence investment plan was repeatedly delayed as disagreements over spending levels continued, creating uncertainty about the future direction of the country's military modernisation efforts. The dispute reportedly centred on clashes between Britain's Defence Ministry and Treasury officials, who remained divided over how much additional funding should be committed to national security and military readiness. The row erupted against a backdrop of rising global security concerns, with conflicts in Europe and the Middle East intensifying calls for Western governments to strengthen their armed forces and defence industries. The tweet by now-resigned UK's Defence Minister, John Healey said, and I quote, "As I've outlined to you, there are credible ways of meeting the mid-term funding challenges, working multinationally and as other European nations are doing, to allow us to protect our ability to deliver the missions of our Labour government. However, your DIP financial settlement, which I was first given in full on Monday afternoon this week, falls well short of what is required for defence and the country at this dangerous time. The extra support is backloaded when the pressure of operations and imperative to speed up readiness to fight is in the first 2 years, and it rises to just 2.68% of GDP in 2030, when we will reach 2.6% next year with the investment we are already making. You spelled out the threats last week. It is our intelligence assessment, and the assessment of other countries in NATO, that there could be an attack by Russia on NATO as soon as 2030. Shortly after, Minister of State for the Armed Forces Carns also resigned in protest, deepening the crisis inside the government. Carns said the government is failing to provide the military with what it needs to effectively do its job. The former Royal Marine warned that the character of conflict is changing faster than our procurement can keep up, raising concerns about readiness. He also said the UK is asking its forces to operate in a more dangerous world on a budget for a calmer one. Downing Street later confirmed that Dan Jarvis has been appointed as the new Secretary of State for Defence. John Healey warned that the United Kingdom and its NATO allies could face a potential Russian threat by 2030, arguing that Europe needed to accelerate military preparations in response to a deteriorating security environment. The warning referenced assessments that have circulated among European governments, including a Danish intelligence report that raised concerns about Russia's ability to pose a broader military challenge to NATO in the coming years. However, Moscow has consistently rejected claims that it intends to attack or invade European countries, dismissing such warnings as unfounded and accusing Western governments of exaggerating the Russian threat. In his resignation letter, Healey argued that the government's defence plans were not keeping pace with the scale of the security challenges facing Britain and its allies. The former Defence Secretary said the funding settlement offered to the military left him unable to support the government's approach, ultimately leaving resignation as the only option he believed remained available. Starmer's authority is now being questioned inside his own party following a series of recent electoral setbacks that have raised concerns among Labour insiders. Senior Labour figures have reportedly begun discussing the possibility of a leadership change if election results fail to improve in the coming months. The upcoming by-election is being viewed as a potential trigger for broader internal reckoning within the party if performance continues to decline. As Keir Starmer's leadership wobbles, the Labour Party is increasingly being forced to consider potential alternatives amid rising internal pressure. After bruising local election losses and controversies that have cost him key allies, Starmer is now facing growing signs of unrest and a possible internal rebellion. However, Starmer has refused to step down and has warned that any leadership challenge could trigger political chaos within the government. At the same time, new candidates are reportedly beginning to emerge within the Labour Party, positioning themselves as possible successors if a leadership contest is triggered. Against this backdrop, attention is now turning to the politicians who could be lining up to become the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Wes Streeting is now widely seen as Labour's strongest centrist contender after his cabinet resignation, instantly vaulting to the top of many bookmakers' lists. A self-described admirer of Tony Blair's political model, he favours pro-business messages and reform-heavy public service agendas that appeal to swing voters. Labour's left accuses his camp of dragging the party too far to the right, warning a Streeting leadership would sideline traditional socialist priorities. He supports NHS reforms that include deeper private sector participation, arguing that ideology should not block solutions to chronic waiting lists. Streeting has frequently clashed in public with striking healthcare workers and trade unions, which could make union backing a key battleground in any contest. His resignation has immediately intensified speculation over looming Labour leadership war, with supporters insisting the party needs his boldness at the top. Allies are pushing for a broad leadership contest featuring multiple serious candidates rather than a coronation, hoping Streeting can emerge from a crowded field. Backers describe him as a sharp communicator with long-standing leadership ambitions, someone who has been quietly preparing for this moment for years. Andy Burnham is seen by many inside and outside the party as Labour's most popular potential successor to Keir Starmer. Burnham presents himself as a pragmatic Labour moderniser, but one rooted firmly in northern, working-class priorities. At the heart of his pitch is a vow to take the Manchester model national, using his record as Metro Mayor to argue for devolved power, stronger city region leadership. Burnham is openly critical of what he calls out-of-touch Westminster politics, casting himself as a leader who is closer to everyday life than London elites. Economically, he emphasises investment-led growth over harsh austerity, arguing for better public transport, serious housing reform, and long-term funding for local services. On health, he signals firm support for the NHS as a publicly owned service, while focusing on practical issues like access, waiting times, and the crisis in social care. Politically, Burnham is selling himself as the only figure who can genuinely reunite Labour's left, soft left and centrists behind a single project. And his loyalists present him as an experienced former cabinet minister and Metro Mayor, who has already been battle-tested in government and City Hall. Angela Rayner has built her political brand through the trade unions and direct, working-class messaging that resonates far beyond Westminster. Her style often contrasts sharply with Starmer's lawyerly caution, giving some voters a sense of authenticity and plain speaking they feel is missing at the top. She resigned from government after a row over tax and second home arrangements, a saga that temporarily stalled her leadership prospects. Britain's tax authority later cleared her of deliberate wrongdoing, a finding her supporters say removes the biggest obstacle to a future leadership bid. Many in the party's left and grassroots now believe her ambitions could revive, especially if members want a leader who sounds like them. She still enjoys strong support across Labour's traditional left-wing base, including activists who feel sidelined under Starmer. Analysts describe her image as distinctly working-class and relatable, an asset in red wall seats where Labour has struggled to reconnect. Ed Miliband currently oversees the government's energy and climate agenda, giving him a key role in Britain's transition to net zero. He previously led Labour into the 2015 election, suffering a heavy defeat that helped set the stage for the Brexit and Corbyn years. That loss unleashed years of internal turmoil, and some in the party still link his leadership to the instability that followed. Miliband remains a strong advocate of bold net zero and clean energy policies, arguing they are central to Britain's future prosperity. A number of Labour figures still value his experience, especially as global crises stack up and energy security rises to the top of the agenda. But critics say the memory of his 2015 defeat has permanently damaged his public credibility as a potential Prime Minister. Any fresh leadership bid from him could reopen deep ideological fault lines inside Labour, reviving old battles between centrist and left factions. For now, he remains more of an outsider candidate in leadership gossip, present in the conversation, but not the obvious frontrunner. Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper is widely seen as a safe pair of hands within the Labour Party leadership circle, although she has remained deliberately cautious and publicly coy about any interest in taking the top job. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood is also being mentioned in leadership discussions, but she has so far shown little appetite or urgency to launch a challenge at this stage.